Hello everyone, other lazy day today for answering a question, though, that I think may be important on a delicate topic. Some of you asked after that video I made on how to prepare a university exam, if there's any tip for high school, and if I can expand on that. Well, questions like these are welcome because I kind of searched the pretext to commit myself less, especially now that I'm very busy to the preparation of historical videos. Today would have been a von Clausewitz one, but the chapter was dramatically long, and even though as you know, it takes me like 20 minutes to prepare, it's still too lazy to want to do it now after past 8 p.m. right? So for that, yeah, I'm that weird in terms of times and schedule and whatever. So I take this chance to talk specifically about how to make actually a good use of high school in general, right? I don't remember. I'm going to check now because it's all improvised. If you were asking me specifically how to prepare a high school exam, like a university exam, or if it is something more general that in fact however I will expand on unavoidably, because it's the context rather than the the kind of was any help for a high school exam, right? So this question is interesting, and I was surprised because I actually watched the guy's content. I assumed he was already, that he wasn't that young, because this guy has an interesting channel. I can make some sponsoring here about the American Civil War. I haven't checked his content out, but he seemed determined and passionate about it, so give him support. So any specific tip for the exam in general? Of course, I will be talking in the future too about that. This is not just a one-shot video about high school or university or whatever, because we could expand on several topics at that point. Because everything takes discipline, doesn't it? Right? There is always a discipline to attain certain achievements and to schedule a lot of stuff you can do in life, studying, working, sporting, relationship. It's all a problem after all. That requires a bit of awareness, as always, as the main trick to make it true. So I was a bit embarrassed by the question in the measure in which I don't know the guy. I'm pretty sure he comes from the United States. So as far as I understand, the things there work in substantially different ways from the educational system that I went through, right? It's literally a different type, like there are different types, time methods, and also way of organizing the work. So probably it's not going to be a very helpful video as a response, as in like the fundamentals about the American educational system and how high school fundamentally works. I've had some classmates back in the day. I think one went to New Zealand and came back. He told us a bit of stuff for 1 year. It was 6 months. I don't remember actually. I presume it's somewhat similar. But I think that in there, what surprised him was mostly the different attention dedicated theory and practice compared to the way we do it here. And but I think we can't skip that, because objectively, the high school experience, as far as I understand, can be very, very different. And as I've seen myself, like I've done high school all in one institution, one single environment, let's say. But I knew naturally people from neighboring high schools and so on. One in which also my father back in the day had gone. And also within my own institutions, actually there were two seats. One where I went to for all the 5 years, and that was kind of 3 kilometers away from my own. And there was another one. It was the same school, right? But it had this other seat where I actually went to playing, the so-called, I don't know what you call it in in English, but physical education, training, like a bit of sport and all this stuff. It was only 1 kilometer away from my home. And I preferred actually to went to the first one because albeit it was, more distant, it took me more time, just 20 minutes by bus, 3 kilometers in the city. That's also why I bought a motorcycle at some point, because I detest taking bus. And that's part of my misanthropic behavior, so that you will understand also probably better through this video. And rather than the other one, because the other one was objectively sucked like an environment. And I know it's whether it's the by extraction, like the people who inhabited in the area is also actually closer to the place where I live, to my quarter. So, but there are some divides objectively also in relatively close neighborhoods, and in fact that's what I experienced in middle school, which was I can say a disgusting experience, but was very different from primary school. I had completely kind of a shock change, right, in terms of the people who I knew, first, and the others I met there. Instead, the place where I went was like, the cool place, right, for the, spoiled, really rich kids. Actually, I met a lot true millionaires, like not a millionaire like it could be for European standards, someone who owns a couple of millions. It's not this big deal, but truly people who have money that they don't even know how to put it. It was like, it was a bit posh, was a bit elite, right? And it in fact it's an historical quarter of my city, and it results something about it that was objectively fascinating. It had this reputation for objectively one of the greatest high schools in my own country, because it turned out it was a here we divide high schools in different categories in terms of the programs that they have. They're actually almost identical. There is the let's say the humanistic one and the scientific one. It was a scientific one, and objectively most of the kids who came out of that high school had great results in the polls for certain selections nationwide, in specifically mathematics, in physics, right? That they went on being great. You say, what did you go there for? Well, that's part of the story, and that's also why it's interesting. It can be like meaning that eventually I studied history, so what you're about that I stressed how many times how important it is to have a complete. This is a first advice I can give in general for high school students, or simply even parents, because this video, as you know, I'm not a father. I wish to become one, but at some point, but definitely I don't tell anyone how to raise his or her own kids. It's just that, having gone, a bit beyond with secondary education and so on, seeing certain aspects. I mean, there are objectively many things that I constantly criticize of the reality I live in, that, for example, parents are completely unaware of what is after, if, giving the options that exist and then maybe haven't taken personally, right? So as far as that, I can't be concerned with what I'm talking about. It's the first advice is, which is also a pretty broader take on education, is, and a lot of other things, is to have as much as possible a complete education. I mean, not thinking that your kid is something you can, let's say, bet on simply because you want to address him or her on that path, and that maybe it's not the right one for them, or to make him more educated on, let's say, a scientific or humanistic or whatever. It can be a professional path. I've seen it, for example, with other people I know, because in my country, actually, whichever high school you go, even if it's not, because objectively there is a bit of divide. The humanistic and scientific ones, so-called, are generally speaking considered like the best ones. Then there are a bit the professional ones, or others that take some more technical or artistical take, and everybody thinks that, even if it's not very nice to say that these people are going to be favored, which is not true, right? It really depends. But objectively, I am much more for a standard and complete education for every student. as far as school is concerned, which for many people it's like, but isn't that a waste of time? Like, there are a lot of philosophical implications from this point of view, because there are parents that are generally saying for many reasons. One can be like strictly professional, like you own a business, or you have, I don't know, a study as a doctor, as an architect, whatever it is, and you think, oh, my kid has to take the reins after me, and therefore I will simply lead them to there. Others make it an ideological point, right? That is, but studying, I don't know, things like history, or other stuff that doesn't seem to be very well expandable on the market, which is totally relative, by the way. And part of the problem is the education itself and the way we see education in this regard, because you can't really make a lot of money also if you are clever enough. But unfortunately, yes, on average, it's not because of history or another thing, but also depending on how much you applicate your mind, and that's what a complete education should fundamentally help you to do. So there is a bit this kind, which is strange, I think, especially in the Anglosphere. This is something I see often in American conservatism, albeit I like American conservatism. I'm actually great. I'm much more, American in my conservatism than I'm European in many ways. Because Europe, in either left or right, is too statalistic for my tastes. But I don't know, there is this idea developed in there that fundamentally, you should be focused just on technical, scientific stuff that make you work. And this is something I don't agree on, right? It can't be a good thing, of course, and I always stress that you should be absolutely competent in scientific, mechanical, technical stuff. Even physically, you should be thinking of one day you could make a job that requires your commitment, with skills that are also not just mental, but require discipline in the energies you spend, in the actions you make, the movements, and so on. But you should also need, unavoidably, a humanistic, or whatever you want to call it, education in many ways. This has become now a matter of debate. I know that in the United States currently there is apparently a very intense debate relatively to the fact that universities have been, or many universities have been, somewhat taken over by radical leftism and things like these. I come from a country that after World War II basically split. Unfortunately, this thing that the communists took over education, because they settled with Stalin that they wouldn't make a Soviet revolution in my country, but they kind of split because they had a large electorate that sided. This happened also in other Western European countries, objectively, in the Western Bloc. And therefore there's been an influence of that. I've seen it myself, and definitely for American standards, it would be pure like communism gone wild. I've seen the thing from first-hand experience. Naturally, first of all, from demographic reason, those professors are kind of dying out, right? And there has been naturally an improvement in this whole thing. But I do know what it means also to take a class that you don't like from a politicized professor. I've seen it, I've experienced it, even at university actually, and but I must tell you, it's a healthy experience as well. I mean, if you are intelligent enough to stay detached, not to I presume that by 18, 19, you start university, you are intellectually autonomous, right? Also in terms of critical skills and so on, and that's why high school is so crucial, right? And what I think is that most of the kids in the West are just a bunch of spoiled, I don't even know how to change it. The impression I get is that they're completely empty-minded, right? They've grown old, glued to a screen. They have not learned how to just maintain focus or attention or discipline, and to make to put thoughts together into something built, structured, systematic. I don't see it anymore, right? I personally think there will be a generational problem, because I conceive myself as one of the last, right? Having been born in the early 90s, there is probably a divide between our generation that arrived up to, I mean, this also involves actually, a matter of also demographic and other social dynamics that naturally in my country can be different, but especially guys that have been born from the in the 80s, especially towards the late 80s and the early 90s, will still have maintain an optimum of balance in terms of the future chances for education and job altogether, right? It's not just thinking about the millennials or the Generation Z or all this stuff that I don't even fundamentally agree very much on as a segmentation, but that just to make you consistent example of what I'm talking about, that we actually had to learn something, right? I was talking with one of my PhD colleagues, and we are basically the same age. We were born in the same year, and he has a brother that is much younger than him actually, and like 10 years, something like that. And he notices, because his brother goes to high school, that objectively the today's best student in a class works as much as the some of the worst, those who barely made it to the satisfactory mark did 10 years ago in our times, which sounds like we're very old people and so on, but there is actually a dramatic divide that I think nobody is really focusing on. It's as if education is always saying, kids are always saying they no, there is an enormous divide. What the social networks and the spread of everybody has a phone with an internet connection, whatever, has created an enormous gap that we have no idea, just socioeconomically, but consequently also politically, to fill, right? That presents an enormous problem in education. And I will tell you about this also in terms of technology, what you could do and what you couldn't do. And I'm a pretty singular person because, for example, as you understand, I went to high school fundamentally in the second half of the first 10 years of the 2000s. And so people had internet on their phone, they had internet at home. I actually had internet at home for choice, because my father freaked out because we had only one computer, and that if we had an internet connection, we would get a virus or something, all this data would be lost. Internet connection at home only at 18, right? So basically I went through all basic up to the last year of high school without internet at home. I usually use the internet when you can understand how brutally different the world can be for a person that up to that age has not been raised with the internet. You say, the older followers will say, oh well, I did, yeah, but it's rare. Like we're a few people that actually have been grown with pencil and paper to do stuff, and that eventually has also been acquainted with the digital early enough, let's say, to be functional with it. And so that's very different from a person that doesn't know what pencil and paper is. What banally, how much it takes just to, for example, the physical effort to write. You would say, how difficult it is to write. Well, ask the Benedictine monks. I would ask you, but I think objectively that all the time I was writing my homework, my stuff, and I had to stop because my hand, it's not that hurt, but like my nerves, like my hand didn't respond anymore, because I had kept, I'm also very, I don't know to say that, but I don't know why, I always keep my jaws also very tight. I put a lot of physical energy in things I do, and just even how to grab pants in a very primitive way, because my hand don't even have many gentle moves, totally inept, and my nerves got tired. And I remember also of course it was an effort, it took more time. Just think, I work exclusively with computer now, and of course I realized that just think about the thesis, a serious thesis. My current thesis has something like 30,000 quotes. A work like this would have not even been imaginable like only 20 years ago, right? Not even when computers were spreading fairly commonly in homes, right? I had my first computer, I think, when I was 11. I don't remember. Yeah, but just to make an example, there are these big differences that for the sake of learning and focusing and attention is very, very, very important. So I hope that also this perspective, having lived in between the two things, can be good. Because let's be honest about this, the internet is a huge distraction, and positively speaking, too, because without it, you wouldn't grow so quick and smart. And objectively, I can tell you that I wish at some point I had a limited access to the internet to understand at least certain things, not much about how a computer works or how certain other things are, but probably to understand the world in the way I've been studying it ever since I had finally an internet connection at home. I usually went for using the internet to the local library, right? Pretty close to that other, disgusting seat where people were all of my high school where people were all okay. Well, it was not really disgusting, but it was just a bunch of thugs and not very receptive. It looked bad. But that's another problem. I've never been bullied in high school, so and I had very mild bullying experience in passively speaking in my life. Unfortunately, also actively, I must say that when they might talk about bullying, which is a quite controversial yet extremely important topic, and no, I will not make the point that we need a lot of bullying, just for making people tougher, but there is something that should be understood also in those dynamics that is extremely important also for these years that are of dramatic, in fact, importance for the construction of the individual. And actually in high school, you're already an old person. What I said also last time is that what actually forms you largely as an individual and also in your intellectual capacity has to do, in my opinion, in those middle school, right? In 11, 13, 11, 14, those are the years. Those are the ones where when you learn something, it's for life, right? And if you have not structured your brain in those years, you went to a middle school that sucked, like unfortunately it's the case, because middle school remains, in fact, a bit too much in between still the idea that it's, nor something serious, not something, particularly unimportant. And very often the person, at least I've seen it, is not dramatically qualified, at least in my country. It's a broader, social issue. It's not a really such a dramatic problem. I think actually my country has fairly good educational system in terms of the actual didactic, which is very often underestimated, but it's still in relative terms, compared to other places I've seen, and still it sucks worldwide, right? It's not that if you have been born in the West, you're actually your schooling is actually positive the way it's been received. It's like what for mid 20th century standards good could be conceived, but for those time standards that sucks badly. And most people really, as I told you, come from high schools like us, people have at this point never made a true effort, right? Never have framed what is that they have to do in the first place, right? It's really embarrassing, and I will not go further about also what I've seen in my country, in other countries, because certain things I've seen were devastating. But that's also important in the sense that it's not all about didactic. Of course, the environment is very important. If half of the kids in your classroom have a parent that has been in jail, or maybe that's quite excessive, but not so much, right? We also should try to understand where's the boundary between a good life standard. In terms also, parents are crucial in a kid's life, as you understand, or whoever teaches them. I mean, of course, people can grow up very well also without their parents, but still with people that actually care about them and give them an order, a line, properly. There are in English. Now, I cannot make too many linguistical sophistries also because you understand where I come from, but there is this idea that education is somewhat something more pertinent to to school and to whatever, place you went to study things to. But in my country, for example, we use the same term to actually qualify specifically what your parents teach you, right? We should say, well, it's kind of a permanent thing, it's like where the parents, the families still do the work of the state. Well, it's not entirely, it's not in part this, right? In part it's not, in the sense that it's even beyond what the state does, but it's probably about the fact that if you haven't been taught manners, politeness, self-control, like even banal, like not knowing how to stay seated and to shut up, right? You can't go very much out there in the world and being a socially functional person, right? I've read some studies. It actually says that between 2 or 4 years old, you haven't properly learned how to behave. Already at that age, basically you will be incapable to be fully integrated in a society, if not in a dysfunctional way. And a lot of clinical cases you find out here, properly medically so or not, just people that you would just like to beat to death just because of how nervous they make you. It's because they actually had messed up childhood or parenthood. They react properly to the fact that society spits in their face because they can't cope with it in a different manner. And of course this causes a lot of malaise, and where do you think also a lot of extremism comes from? Actually, it's about our frustration. We all have it at some level. The point is getting the right balance, right? It's a point of saying, okay, that a lot of problems unfortunately happen, historically speaking, just in our times, just finding a job, a house, founding a family, and going on with your life honestly. It's becoming very difficult in certain contexts, right? Not just because maybe you can't find a job or whatever, but properly because this kind of a priori teaching at the roots of the individual's growth are rotten, right? And I'm not making it kind of a moralistic point here. This is pure science. Like, this is what we're being told day after day from studies that deal with this stuff. And never believe in the culturalist stuff that tells you, that everybody can fundamentally educate oneself, right? Just by believing in those values. No, it doesn't happen like that. There is a biological component that you cannot eradicate from humanity by definition, and that's a very dangerous thing, because there are certain political sides, especially the most extremistic ones, that stress exactly that is not true, that you can erase all of that base, right? That biological differences do not matter, that it's all like what the influences you receive educationally. That's not how it works. But there is, in this sense, also a very complicated field we can't touch. But high school, as I was saying before, is a moment in which most of all this stuff should have been surpassed, right? The crucial moments are naturally primary school. I mean, since childhood to this, whatever, you start high school at 14 years old. In high school, you're already old. That is, your brain is fresh enough up to roughly 24 years old to absorb an enormous amount of information, right? And that's what, in fact, I think also another good advice for high schoolers to do is never stop just at what high school tells you to do. General advice also for parents: never think that education properly in school is anything not even remotely near to the fulfillment of a person's proper education, because school will never do the work for you. You will have to do it by yourself, and if you lack those bases, you go nowhere, right? And that's also why there is a lot of malaise that people think that school should be reformed, because everybody has to do the thing to her own means. I mean, a human brain that is not capable to understand, what school programs are up to high school is and that feels the need that to go away, to refuse that model education, and simply, let's be honest, either you have a mental problem, that is to say you're mentally deficient by biological standards, or the truth, which is 99.9% of the cases, is that you're just lazy, undisciplined, and you don't want to make any effort to get that education. Right? This is the great problem. And if you start from the most obvious thing, that nobody cares very much about education as much as discipline, for example, anymore. In this sense, it's obvious you will find these individuals for which education fails, but properly, because it's of course the education's fault, but it's also the fault of an entire social reality that lives around it. And that is partly accomplice to this. For example, in high school, I must tell, aside from maybe one exception, I had, I don't know, a dozen teachers or something more throughout all the 5 years, but except one, they were all good teachers, right? They were competent people in their field. They might have been, humanly weak at some levels, but they worked. In middle school, there were teachers that frankly sucked badly, right? I've met in high school eventually kids that had gone even to better middle school than I had gone. It was also not bad, actually. And they had similar experiences. In fact, I realized that even the geniuses of my class that always did, were just 2 or 3, that always scored the top, etc., still had faults and got surprisingly low marks, exactly because, that teacher they had told me about for middle school for that specific subject sucked, and they hadn't learned the thing in middle school. And you see how the problem reverberates in later years, and that's not something you can fix, right? Like when you're an adult, of course your brain is much more powerful. Like you can learn things in a way much more functionally, because you know what are the tools that you need, right? When you're in school, it's when you're learning what those tools are and how to use them. But the problem is that when you're an adult, you can even use those tools and make the thing quick, but your brain will not retain it, right? So the point I was making is that in high school, you should mostly actually inform yourself, let's put it in these terms, like getting a lot of knowledge, a lot of info from all the channels you can imagine, while the basis for your brain working well in the process should have already been established during your 11, 13 years old. Of course, during high school, you can't partly fix that. Actually, high school, at least in my country, is, and as I've seen, this is an informal subdivision, but I presume it's the same in other countries, because it's based, in fact, biologically rather than artificially inducted by the teaching, is that, like, the first 2 years are very similar to middle school. Like, you have a lot of homework, and you still have this teacher checking if you've done it, step by step, that all the class corrects it together and so on. The last 3 years are instead, so from where you're 15, 16 years old onwards, you instead start to study as if you were at university, at least not quite in the same way, of course, and not in the same contents, but still in a way that is more scheduled, which you're left a bit more of autonomy, but there's also probably more to study, quantitatively speaking. And I presume that it's in those years, like in those first 2 years, you can, and as it's usually done, because high school teachers know about what happens also in middle schools, that you should fix those problems that you haven't fixed in middle school as it starts happening, because it's probably a more complex system, right? In primary school, you learn just a bunch of stuff, and in there, for example, discipline, know how to be quiet, respectful, and so on should be the priority in many ways. I had a beautiful primary school experience, and I could have done more, maybe didactically speaking, I recognize that, but it was really a good environment. They really made us learn a lot in that thing. In middle school is where the mess happened, because the volume of information and especially the structure of it is more complex, right? But that's exactly where you should have the best environment ever, so that you can, instead, those are usually the worst environments ever, because kids at that age are kind of crazy, because they enter they start developing, and their hormones are crazy, and bullying starts, and they have worries, they're complex about each other, about themselves, their role. So it's actually a very messed up situation that is also in their biological mean to spur a reaction in your mind, right? And to start building on your own certain primitive ways of reacting to the world. Like the age in which you start getting toughened up, that you're not a kid anymore, that is exactly that age, right? That's where many controversial things start happening in your mind, and you're provoked by it, and it's as it should be. By high school, you should be like already a young man, ideally, right? Objectively, by 14 years old, I was 6'1", as I am now. I was already physically an adult. Of course, mentally speaking, I was still to develop. And high school is very important for the intellectual development proper, because that's, as we were saying before, and you understand, up to 24 years old, that's also the years of university, right? So it's all where you should getting a lot of information, as much as you can, and structure all together. So my advice for high school specifically is that, of course, I talk now from a perspective that is far beyond that, and therefore I confess you that I spend most of the time thinking like, oh, damn, if I just had done that thing at that age instead of playing video games or wasting time. And sometimes I think I'm too harsh with myself, which I kind of like, because it's a way of discipline, self-disciplining myself in many ways. But I realized that, of course, that as a kid, that's a bit different. Even video games, for example, are very useful, right? I must confess to you that if it hadn't been for my, for video gaming, I would have not properly even been possibly a historian, right? Of course, there was a deeper reason to that, but certain things eventually blossom along the years, also because you get more interested in something. I remember I was passionate about flight simulators, and at the end of high school, my final thesis was about strategic bombing during World War II. It was kind of crazy, but yeah, I loved it. I mean, it was very difficultly connectable with other topics, but that's what I liked, right? And I didn't even know I would actually study history after high school at that point, even if I would have liked it already. And there are also lots of other things that happen also in your private life, right? That can shake you in some way. For example, I had a quasi-nervous breakdown the last year of high school, because I was basically rejected by a girl. I had been in love for a whole year, and I had gotten paranoid about it, and that was not a healthy thing. I can't tell. Actually, I can tell you that I didn't fully recover, in my opinion, from a psychological point of view, up to when I started studying history, which I should at university, which should help the thing when I was 20. And it was a very painful thing, and it also kind of undermined, especially the last year, my will to study. It's something that happened. It was very serious, actually. I don't think I went pathological, but there were symptoms in there that were quite close to what you would call it minor depression. And I must tell you, at the time, it was rough. I don't think even today that it was kidding about it. Right, it really suffered a lot. It wasn't a childish thing. At least the things I felt were quite serious. But and that thing, for example, changed my life in many ways. And I don't know whether even that last year of high school might have started for me, might have gone for me in different ways. I might learn, for example, for me, that last year was completely useless, aside from this sentimental story, because I felt that by the previous year, by the fourth year, I had completely topped everything I wanted, right? It was the time I had met this girl, and I felt like if I had been working, it was a very spiritual thing, if I had been studying a lot, if I started doing a lot of sport, I was doing stuff like crazy. I got always the best marks. Like, all the class said, what the hell did you do to be like this? Not because I was bad before, but I was like burning everything, like devouring all the stuff I was presented to work on, and etc. And then I had this breakdown the year afterwards. So that's, for example, an incidental thing that can change you at many levels. But I must tell you that the most important thing I learned in high school was when I was 15, 16. That actually stemmed from a combination, even here, of things you may not be exposed yourself to. Every person, I tell you, also from an historical point of view, when you study history, and everybody likes to find the great big reasons, right, for events to happen. But very often, especially in a biography, what matters, but also when you study multiple people together, is their individual stories, right? Never give for granted every person is like the same, right? There are things that people do similarly to each other, quite similarly to each other. There's conformism also for biological reasons that goes on, but it's never quite the same thing, and especially at a intellectual level. And also the Clausewitzian idealism here made me realize a lot of things in the next years, because I was very idealistic at the time, then eventually shifted towards more structuralist vision, and then I came back to idealism in these years. Is properly what, the amazing role of your mind, right? In the first 2 years of high school, I had difficulties it was with maths, right? I didn't go to private lessons yet, so I hoped I could make it alone. Instead, nobody in class properly explained me what I had to do. As soon as I went to private lesson, I started to get very good marks. So that's also when you see how education fails. If it depended on me, ideally, I would have liked at that point to have a completely private education with, like, in the 18th century, with the preceptor that comes home and makes you, cuts, the program around you in some ways, but also not leaving you too much space to escape the most difficult things either. And this thing of the exam, just also coming to the point of exams and how to prepare to them, of course, every subject is different, right? Very different. And maths should be technically easier, because in high school, actually, I as I told you, I was doing the scientific thing, so a scientific high school. So in here, it's not that there was much more maths than the other high schools, but it was more intensive in the sense that the general preparation was more scientifically oriented. It was very kind of also a flexible system. But objectively, it was very easy. Like, if I had to do it again, I don't think I would have any problem, because now, of course, I know what it's about, but that's exactly what the point was at the time, that they hadn't told me properly what it was about. That's why I failed, right? And that's why school is so fundamental, why many people actually fail at it, because it may be the same school. Actually, it may be the same fact that it's very difficult to question, for example, how a teacher teaches, especially from someone that still doesn't know what is going to be taught, right? So many kids receive this passively and do not even realize before it's too late, let's say. But preparing to exams, remember, there was a friend of mine. We always talked about motorcycles, and we visited, we hang out, we inhabited close to each other. We had the same problem, right? We took the same bus, and we were always planning these strategies, like including doping ourselves before the examination with sugar, because that would have kept our mind up before the class, before the test, right? The big test of maths, those things that happen thrice or 4 times a year, for which everybody was thoroughly preparing, and always getting these marks that sucked. But I always managed never to make any reparation. Like, every year I completed with all the satisfactory marks in every subject. I was doing fine. That's also partly what saved me, because actually, my school system is evil, because technically, if you do well in all the other subjects, they tend to close an eye also on the one you do worst. And the other guy, for example, had very similar marks to mine. He instead got reparations, and eventually the year after went also to another school because he had this problem. All these stories that were of camaraderie, right? The high school was, I must say, when I left, that was kind of boring, because I remembered how much funnier and much more, uh, you know, I would say criminal. At some levels, middle school was like in middle school. The laughs I had in middle school were amazing. Like the most stupid things when a kid in the class says something stupid and everybody feels the need to say something sooner in turn, right? Yeah, that's the most idiotic stuff. So I had a lot of fun in here. But high school is the one that stuck in my feelings the most. I don't know, it's something strange. I always dream of it, for example. I went through lots of other stuff afterwards, and I always dream high school. It's kind of strange, isn't it? Like, it's something that impressed my mind very, very. I don't know how, why. But just for saying it, there is also this relational side of the story with your classmates that you start knowing also in an age in which at this point you hang out on your own, you go meet other people, you decide how to spend your time the way you like completely. So there is something about high school that is also about that teaches you how to make it autonomous, and these exams were very tough. I don't even remember at this point how I used to prepare, because especially for maths, I remember when there were these examinations of philosophy, sometimes I spent like 8 hours studying, and I knew how to do it, and it worked. With maths, I didn't quite know what to do, because the theory there was not quite required, right? There was a huge load of homework, and I kept doing these exercises which rarely turned out correctly. I said, what the hell did I do wrong? I was also lazy, and I was bored by it. I remember I always got at the end a satisfactory mark, because in the first 2 years there was geometry and arithmetics, so it was the full mark was split in half, and the satisfactory mark is 3 out of 5. So I did well in Euclidean geometry. I usually I took like almost of the entire half, and then I made the tiny thing that allowed me to pass sometimes from 2.5 to 3, and to get the satisfactory mark, right? But and it came in natural because geometry, I don't know, I'm able to read through lines and things, and it was fascinating to me. I learned a lot of stuff. It was very satisfying because I made it, with arithmetics was terribly boring, and I always made some mistake, which is technically easier because at least in there you know exactly what to do step by step. Is that no? I like the geometry. Well, seemingly it's normal that your brain is either predisposed for geometry or arithmetics, and so I didn't even properly prepare. That's also possibly the reason why I didn't take good satisfactory marks at the beginning. But in those years, because when I that's also an important point for high school. When you're in middle school, you have to decide which path to take in that sense. And at that year, you don't know what it's like, right? I was advised by my middle school teachers to make the scientific high school for the stupid idea that you kind of get more money with maths, right? And they didn't actually realize I wasn't evidently very versed for the scientific side, but it's something that, however, taught me a lot, right? I wouldn't be the person I am today if I hadn't gone through that struggle. So that was dramatically important to me. I even did well in middle school in maths, but the first troubles actually with marks began in middle school, and with English. Right, I really couldn't learn it. Right, the grammar was totally difficult for me. I couldn't work well, and that was the first time I started getting unsatisfactory marks, which in primary school had never happened. So I started to feel insecure about it. I started to, and eventually instead I managed to do it alone, which made me very proud and confident. So much that in high school, basically, I lived out of this inheritance that I had, things I had learned of the essentials of grammar, at least in middle school, of English. And instead, maths became the main problem, because it was like objectively the things that I had learned in middle school weren't enough for going to the next step, but that middle school was too soft, at least in that subject, and that's in fact what I regret. Like, I wish it had been different. And it became a very serious problem for me, because it seemed to me that high school was more serious thing, that these bad marks were actually a problem. And my parents that had stopped following my homeworking since I was, I think, like 9 or 10, were worried as well. And I've always done a lot of all this for them, actually. And for myself, of course, but it's as if it was the same thing in many ways. And I started being worried of how trying to find useful strategies on how to fix that, and that also helped me in some ways. But it was always very difficult. I just made it by a miracle. There are so many stories from those years that would be dramatically useful to explain what motivation can bring you to do, right? Even for something that seems banal. But that's also a very important starting point when you go in high school. Never think that, of course, those marks are going to define who you are, but still be aware that school is important, right? That if you get those marks, it's not because someone is doing something against you, because there is some plot, conspiracy against you, even just inadvertently, or that you're unlucky. You should be starting to face, as an adult, the responsibility that you have towards the person that you are and what you will also become in the future, and the people that will depend on you in this regard, and realize that probably you can do better, and there is something you can fix by yourself. And even if you still found it was an unjust system, and that's the realization that struck me at some point, that I couldn't complain, right? When I was 16, and that's what the combination was talking about, I began to study philosophy in high school with a professor that was kind of weird, but still, a good one. And that, I mean, he was the same one of history. He would say, "Oh, well, you studied history because of the..." No, I didn't, actually. Because he was, first of all, an archaeologist transformed into professor of history and philosophy. And then I had another guy last year that was even kind of weirder. And that, they didn't particularly inspire me. But I must say that this first one, objectively, he was much more in philosophy than he was into history, actually. In fact, I was disappointed relatively to the latter. I studied more history through literature, for example, than through those classes. But in terms of philosophy, I knew I had to study. It was mandatory, right? And before that, I thought that I even had heard of von Clausewitz at the time. It's not that I began to study von Clausewitz at the time. Absolutely not. It was much more recent. But I thought it was a bit like literature, wasn't it? Right? It was something strange, like reading text. Instead, it was something totally different. In my country, we study philosophy like history of philosophy. That means that we start literally from ancient Greece and arriving to the 20th century, and in 3 years, one after one. And it is beautiful, because you see, you fall in love with one philosopher, then it comes the next one that contradicts him and says something more complex, and so your brain grows like hell like that. And I remember I was fascinated by Socrates, by also this sense of duty. After all, there is a bit too of Plato, actually, in Socrates, as you know, philologically speaking. But those reflections, I remember in those autumn days or mornings, and everybody was kind of half asleep. There was too, but at least I was listening. I'm kind of a good listener. It made me realize something on the concept of responsibility, on the fact that you are the one that can make the change, right? It's useless to blame others for your shortcomings. Like, it could be that someone prevents you to fulfill your your duty, to do well properly. Right, this is an important philosophical point, because you understand it's very idealistic. It's not structuralist. It also leans towards a specific political aisle, because it's very individualistic in many ways, and that's also why I'm fundamentally a conservative, not from those years, but that's from by extraction. But of course, the years of university, especially the year balance, the high school balanced very much my political views, and university did even more. So that I think I'm kind of moderate, but the background also by nature, by character, is more conservative unitly. And I began to realize that it doesn't matter. Like I began to fall in love with this tragic destiny of the world. Like the most important thing is not what actually happens, but how much effort you've put to make it go otherwise. And this was extremely useful for motivating me in those maths tests. Also, I began, those private lessons that solved the problem. But what remained actually within, because eventually from those years I always started studying analytic math, so it was much easier in many ways, telling the truth. I mean, it's more complex, but honestly, it's much easier than one of the previous years. Like in the previous years, you're brutally brought to kind of a, it's a bit like the difference we make in military history between individual training and collective training. Individual training, nobody actually teaches you how to do it, or at least you have to do most of the work by yourself and brutally, right? Either you learn it or not. Instead, collective training is based on something that someone has pre-planned, and you have to make a lot of effort in, complexively, but you already have the pattern, you already have the manual how to do it, and then you can try again until it works, and it's way more effective, right? So towards the last 3 years, also lots of things changed, because most of the worse but kind of funnier classmates we had abandoned the institution, because they couldn't rate it. My high school passed for a very difficult one actually at the time, but I must tell you that was very difficult. I don't know what the rest is probably. And I began to be ever more solitary than I was before, and I started to fall in love with this idea of perspectives. And one thing that I began to do on a regular basis was to read on my own. Right, I've always read my life, also since I was a child, but I never did it up to that point with the awareness that implementing my education on my own would have brought me somewhere that otherwise I would have not. Right, and I can tell you easily that at the point where I am, if I hadn't done that, I would have not made it. Right, because even just by a tiny margin, too many things have gone right in my life up to this point following that track. You would say, well, but maybe if you had done something, maybe you'd have been lucky or capable in another way. That is also true. But for this specific path that I chose, objectively, what I began to learn towards 16 years old, which is dramatically late, that's something you should understand by 12, by 13. In fact, I always regret, as I was telling you before, is that you should be, and I've always felt old for it, should be reading a lot of stuff on your own. To read, right? Not just hang out to be a jerk and, just because all the others do, right? I was lucky enough. I was misanthropic in my own ways. I didn't have much of, social relations at the time, but not because I was, as I was saying, I wasn't bullied. It was my deliberate choice. Like I didn't like it. I thought it was a waste of time. It's also part of laziness, but it was about the same discipline of work, right? For example, when I had an exam, I always planned what I had to do first, right? It's not that I had a test, let's be more specific, or an examination. An examination, as you understand, is a better term overall, but I needed to be prepared. Like I couldn't bear the idea of going to, the professor, or starting a test, being asked something and not knowing what to say or write, right? It's something I've never been able to think like. This is probably thanks to my parents that inculcated me the idea that I had to not to get the best mark, but to always do my duty, right? Which is also very important. My parents, I think, were dramatic. Sometimes I think they should have, I don't know, made me, in fact, read more stuff. But then I realized that probably I might have felt as if I had been imposed that, right? Lots of kids. Sometimes those who actually come to be more successful people in terms of career you discover that their parents were kind of not just disciplinarians, the sake of it, because sometimes they also messed up, with a weird retribution system, but probably they insisted a lot on them being always busy with something. That it could be, the school, the friends, or sport, and they had always to get the best marks. I knew these people, right? And they are actually very good, smart, intelligent, but sometimes they're not so happy, they're not so balanced, they're not so convinced, right? For me, the question of autonomous motivation is something that I met quite clearly, and that I learned quite clearly of in that point of my life. And from that point of my life, I took off, like in just an intellectually autonomous way. And I've never felt myself, as I told you many times, and I don't want to be considered an intellectual, because I'm not as a person. Believe it or not, I'm much more practically oriented than I am, with my mind. I'm much more concrete. But I thank also the scientific education for that, because I see that most of my colleagues now are fundamentally, humanistically educated at the root, and I'm not. Together with a few of them, actually, that in fact proved to have a very different mind, and to have done, even in our fields respectively, some very interesting stuff, historically speaking, thanks exactly to this more, less discursive but more to the point, concrete, vision of history, which is also a different way to make history, because history, as you know, it can vary wildly. Also, in terms of there are some historical works that are pure statistic, that is trash, telling the truth, especially those that are made with all those enormously combined, teams that research all together. That sucks, because there is not a unitary direction, and that's fundamentally a failure. By you already know it's going to be a failure. There are others that is much more like philosophy, the philosophy history. I try to be, concrete. I don't know if you can. You would think that speaking all this long time is proper of a person that is never concrete, but at least every thought I come up with, it's because I think it can be of concrete use. It's not just for saying anecdotal, right? And I learned that at the time. Like, I learned this game, this rule of professor is going to examine, or there's going to be this big test. It doesn't matter what happens, I have to come to that point prepared, right? You really have to study all the time, all right? I remember, actually, I had plenty of time for other stuff, too. I remember studied in the best, because also what happens, technically speaking, unfortunately, also, it's you're at some point in these moment. It can be high school, university, whatever. And tendentially, it's just towards the end that you know how it works and you can do it well. I had it in my fourth year, before my moral breakdown, more than nervous breakdown, because I wasn't motivated. You see, motivation from Clausewitz is really right. And it's during fourth year, I studied just like 4 hours in a day, but it meant I really studied those 4 hours. Like, it's not that I say 4 hours and then it was just like 1.5 on, in practice. No, I really stayed focused, repeated 4 hours, on average. That means that I might have even studied, 8 hours one day and 0 the other one. But for example, I did a freaking lot of swimming. That's something I've been practicing for 12 years, and I could take it. Like, I wasn't mentally exhausted. I was convinced I was gonna get that girl. I was motivated. I felt, flattered by my own, newly achieved superiority in studies. That everything went well. I felt happy. Right then, the thing broke down, and I started doing worse, because I there is also a bit of an intellectual overestimation, right? When everything goes well in your life, do not relax, right? That's the moment in which you should be saving for winter, right? That's also another very important. And the same goes with high school, right? You can even get a very good mark at the first semester, quadrimester, whatever your time, your yearly schedule is subdivided in, but never think that that's enough, right? That's something you should be consolidating. I remember I had all this chart with all the marks I got and calculating the average, all this stuff, and making projections and making graphs to see how the improvement had existed. We spent time during most, school is boring. Let's be honest about it. What I hate of school is that for doing something that you really need there, you have to stay out 5 hours, right? Doing nothing. And that's when you start, I drew a lot of stuff. Sometimes I read in class, right? During some professor's explanation and said, I'm going to read it from the same book, he's explaining it. It's going to be a child's game. Also, another thing, personally, I never made it to do is to actually learn the lesson during the lesson, right? That is, in fact, something that I think seriously needs to be fixed and has a lot to do with what we were saying before about the failure of education and the general, inadequacy of certain means. That is to say, it seemed to me that many professors just, even if they had passion or motivation or they were serious about their job, they just said, okay, I will make this lesson because on the program it has, legally speaking, they had to complete the program. So they had to write in every lesson they made what they had explained, and they had to certify that. Theoretically, these things never happened, but some problem had arisen. The kids also would have been called as testimonies. That there's a very bureaucratic background to this, which many institutions also don't have. Personally, by the way, I studied exclusively in public schools, which actually in my country are better than the private ones. Probably it's the only country in the world. And that is not to say that the public school is dramatically, who knows what, but it's just that to me, the private school, it's where the kids that failed in public school went to, right? That's regularly what happened throughout all my journey. All those kids I was telling you before that left the institutions because it was too difficult for them, and they went from public school to private school where they just paid and got the marks. Now, I'm actually I'm not a pessimistic person, but I always think that behind there is always something negative, that there is always a facade, right? Especially if you're a private institution, you always want to show you're always cool and fit and good, right? Always effective. Very often it is not. Like in private institutions, sometimes the worst things happen. I can tell you because I also went to a private university for 1 year. I've attended some other private institutions along the way. And I see what happens there. I mean, I've seen there, that is not to say that in public schools things went better, but my country has a sound stateless tradition that, after all, did well with education at the end of the day. And so even the differences in this regard it's not because it's my judgment about the private school. Of course, I remember the kids that went to high school, they had their well-thinking parents or grandparents that said, now my kid will go to private school, it's a serious thing, not like in public school, now he will be successful, right? These people, I can tell, were not successful. And also specifically this people that said these things, by the way, and also they didn't want to accept that their grandsons, sons, whatever, were properly failing in the school that objectively was trying to, and for failing at school in my country, you really have to be really bad, right? It's not that you fail because there is some conspiracy behind it or because it's so dramatically difficult. So the most striking and objective difference between public and private school, at least in my country, was there, right? And I've met people that elsewhere. I had an ex, for example, went to private high school, and she told me that it was disgusting. So especially from a moral point of view, and I also thought that she actually, she actually learned some things well, but generally speaking, didn't seem to me she made this tremendous effort. Also, perhaps because also the universities were instead public, where she went to, were also fairly good, but well, who knows? It's the combination of factors. Even might have been the parent. It's the vision of the world that ultimately a person has. I remember when I went out of high school. When I finished high school, I can't say I knew the world, of course, but at least I had kind of an awareness about certain things that I had learned in school. And that is important, especially you would say history or politics. Those are things if you take seriously, right? If instead of playing with your iPhone all the time, you listen to your professor. There are things that thought-provoked me in that sense, and that I surely remember. I learned it from that person. Most probably my classmates wouldn't, because they were just playing, PlayStation Portable. I remember I played it too, by the way. I didn't have it, but we shared it. There were certain situations we would do it, especially that it was just in the first 2 years. It's kind of a sucky teacher, professor that could do whatever hell we wanted with it, and it was terrific, right? But that was the only class in which it could happen. Once a guy even brought a football and started playing, it even fell out of the window. So it was something devastating. Now you will think I went to the disgusting place. It was really not. It was actually a very serious place, I swear. It's just, it was that specific professor that made us do, the incredibly idiotic things. And I took, actually, I think very seriously. Like, I was morally, I was very, puritanic at the time. Right, I felt I was shocked by certain things that happened there. Not because they made me laugh, and I participated to a certain amount. But I said, "What the hell? Like, is this how it really works, and nobody really does anything against it?" Right. I've always felt this idea that I developed at the time that I began to divide it. There, it was a rudimentary vision in my teenagers, but the idea that of course there is what you have to do for yourself, and then what happens next to it. And the thing is that what happens next to it, you shouldn't care about. You should have, let's say, your own way. You shouldn't be depending on, the school at that age is technically all you should be seriously thinking about, right? You can't think about sport, you can think about girlfriends, whatever. That's important as well, but concretely, as an advice, the thing you should take seriously as an opportunity. I think this is the crucial point. But many people see school as just it's mandatory, right? You have been sent there. You have to do it, and it's boring. You're down with homework, with teachers, all this stuff, But the reality is that of course you should be. From one side, the teacher can help you to develop such interest. But at the same time, and that's the age in high school in which you're a young adult fundamentally, which you are supposed to start thinking by yourself, right? This is probably the single most important thing I was trying to explain to you before. That is, I don't do this because I have to please my family or the teachers, or I have to whatever reason brings you there. To maybe even a competition with your classmates, things like these. I've never seen it like that, but there is always a bit of competition, in a friendly way. But properly, you should care about the fact that those are years that you really consecrate to education, right? Or whatever you will have to do next. There are people who seem to be very also, straightforward. That they're very, very clear plans after school. I want to do this and that. Yes, but most of the times it's like, if you're finding a part-time job or that stuff, it's not what it's gonna resolve your life, right? And school, in that sense, has a much more powerful potential we can ever imagine. Right, you're not a more emancipated person just because you started working early. Like if you had to do it forcefully, that's good for you. That surely taught you something. But if you have an option, the idea is think very well what school is. Have you ever realized it, right? It's not the pro-teaching message, I'm just telling you the school sucks at many levels, but there is still something in the programs, in the books, even what professor says, of course, or the debates with your classmates, right? I had some, very good. I remember we had very interesting debates with some of my classmates. It was especially a guy that now he's doing has finished actually at this point a PhD in physics in Vienna, and he basically we wanted to study history together, right? We mostly discussed philosophy. And we were very intrigued. We all had a very different vision of the world, but we liked each other. And at that intellectual level, we exchanged a lot. And we were very interested both in history and philosophy together, in the world, even in the scientific idea of what is the universe, banally, right, at those levels, but looking at, the laws of thermodynamics, with the principle of determination of Heisenberg, all this stuff, and reflecting all together trying to sort out what this big thing was, right? And I missed that person, actually. I think he came back to I don't know where he lives now, but, we even live pretty close. But I never talked, I didn't have many connections with most of my former classmates, but, those are moments in my life that I will never forget, because they were kind of beautiful, they were romantic, they were thought-provoking, they were, that they made me think a lot of things I sometimes come back on with my mind that are a bit the same big problems. When you are at that age, especially at the end of high school, you feel like you're taking the big jump, the great leap forward towards, the world and success, and all the stuff. But then those are things you start wondering at the end of the day, and that tells you our high school, after all, did a good job, because we were thinking about that, we were debating about that. So we received, after all, aside from my strict methods of evaluating that reality, we really got what we were to discuss. And I remember that there are lots of things in literature, that really we got there, and good job for kids of that age, right? But the point is, you are still on your own, right? And this is what I've learned. Exactly, also because I've never seen those people, if not randomly, anymore. It's what you've done that made the difference, right? And we'll keep making it, right? So high school also sometimes gets crazy if you have crazy schedules. You went out at night. You had hangovers and all this stuff. Personally, never done it I think never got drunk in my life. I've always drank. But, it seems as if there is something else, right? People get absolutely most polarized by things that are not high school, of course. They want to have like a personal life at that age. It seems such a big deal. That's important as well. But objectively, the time you can take at that age, without any deadline, without any pressure, you will miss it, right? Because now, for example, I'm freer at certain levels. It's that collective training that I got, that comprehensive, measurement that I got. But it's not that I can't technically do all what I want. When I was at that age, I could even choose to go out swimming for 3 hours in the afternoon and still have enough time to study and to be good with it and to get good marks. Now I couldn't do that. Now I'm counting every single damn minute. You will say, why do you make these videos then? Well, because they help me, maintain the balance, right? That's exactly that. I need to vent. I need to speak up my mind. I need to do something that makes me realize the point I'm at, right? Usually at that age I wrote a diary, which you think is a girly thing, but it wasn't actually. It was like more of a kind of a dramatic / romantic update of my sentimental failure, and exactly at that age. And it started, but it helped me, because even at that point I needed to maintain the balance. It's not that wasn't taking a toll on me. Even studying and doing anything, it's not a ideal thing, right? You actually feel the fatigue, right? You start feeling, wow, I've been doing this today, it's enough, I'm tired, I can go to sleep, complete. But it still requires motivation, and I had that motivation, but even in there I needed a balance. So the same goes with the schedule, with tests and examinations and so on. You should be really make a plan. For example, I really like to schedule everything like across the month. I had specific days I marked on my agenda. I had all my estimates. That's when I began, and I told you last time to pretend I was kind of a general that had created his army and to send it under the enemy fire during the examination and the test. And there was all this preparation. I could perceive whether the ranks were well structured, if they were disciplined enough, they marched in well coordinated and so on. And then I would fight the battle during the examination or the test, and something and that teaches you in the calculation of probabilities, or the game. It makes you kind of more aware of what even the secrets behind those dynamics are, right? The preparation, the evaluation, all the stuff. And that's something I've kept working at this point on, because I've been true still all this path of education, and I can tell you that was dramatically useful, right? That what I did in high school, objectively, it's not something I value as different from what I do today. Like, but by 13, 14 especially years old, before I see myself still as a kid, right? As a child, even at certain levels. From 14 years old onwards, I'm basically the same person. That's also very important to realize, that you are at that point really an adult, right? At least in terms of potential, but not even proper, right? There are certain ways your mind is formed at that point that is what is going to remain for most of your life. And it's a serious point. It's very rarely stressed that what you start doing in high school starts being serious, also as a matter of learning and discernment, right? Sometimes it's even, we were asked to do hard stuff as well, learning by heart lots of pages. There was a lot of homework. Like, homework was really a lot. It's typical of my education, and that was formative objectively, right? It really served to some purpose. I remember those insane winter afternoons with sinusitis, and I didn't want to say, but I needed to. I felt nauseated because I had to, right? I had learned that it was my duty, and it was like motivationally speaking, and I insist very much on this. It was as if I owed it to something, right? I had a very spiritual side in all this. I felt that I really, like, it was an existential, visceral reason for getting a good mark. I was really concerned about it, but not in the sense, what others will think because I'm a fan. No, because I needed to be successful in that proof, that would enable me to get to the other one. And another very interesting thing, of course, of education is this constant, gradual passage, step by step towards something more demanding. That's also why today I feel, right, if I had done this and that at the time, but I probably wouldn't understand it. I would have not understood it at the time. I mean, and distractions too were, I needed them as well. Like, I couldn't be thinking about school all the time. That's why video games were a bit of a refuge sometimes, especially after lunch when I came back from school. I was tired and said, I need that break. I really need to shoot those people, on the, first person shooters, all this stuff. And it vented me, it may stabilize me. And then, after a couple hours, I would go study seriously, and I would do till the evening. Then maybe I play another bit, and then read something, then go to bed after dinner. And over time, I especially realized when I had enough digital stuff in my hand that becomes difficult. Sometimes there are plenty of stuff you want to do, see, and you get even overly excited. Maybe you have, I don't know whether my experience is too singular, given especially the absence of the internet in my, at least about direct access at home in that specific part of my life. It's very peculiar. It becomes impossible at this point, right? Coupled with especially a good, say a good level of education. Today everybody gets that, right? It's the standard pack. Maybe it helped me to evaluate something else, right? I could talk endlessly about these topics, like even how I saw studying, right? There were certain subjects, for example, that I liked a lot. I remember when I studied Latin literature, medieval literature, already at the time, I liked them in a way that maybe I liked it. The professor, yes, she was cool objectively, and I liked also other subjects. There was a bit of combinations that got to that point, but I realized that on those pages there was something that I truly liked, right? And even if I probably would have never read it if I hadn't been obliged to by school, but that I still realized it was a good opportunity to take, right? This video, I don't know if it answers to how to prepare an exam, because it has not much to do with it. It really doesn't tell it happens. It's largely similar actually to how I explained how to do a university exam, except maybe I didn't summarize the contents. Like, usually it's like maximum some tens of pages by any examination. So yeah, you can underline stuff in the book, but it's mostly about how you repeat that, right? So it's mostly, to me, was an effort of memory rather than else, right? Of course, I like to argument the thing, to express it. I liked especially those discursive things like history or philosophy. History was the easiest. Then I liked also written exercises, because at least you didn't have to, it's important that you just wrote them, right? Even if they were wrong, not always. Surprisingly, I liked chemistry. That was very, very fascinating, but also studied it just for 1 year. Then I don't know if I would have liked to continue with that. But let's say, of course, I did that because I had to do it. I would have done something else with my life. I actually awaited vacations, I waited breaks, but I naturally also used them to plan the better. For example, we got an enormous amount of homework for Christmas vacations, right? Even for summer, maybe in proportion less, of course, but even those Christmas vacations, you had to spend them studying because they overloaded you sometimes, and it was interesting. Maybe that's why this video. Maybe I would like to quit it now, quickly. But there was always this trial with yourself, this competition, this continuous test on yourself, and that pressure, in the right amount, actually was very useful. Right? Objectively, I couldn't tell you that a successful education can come without that, right? This idea that kids have to be left to do only what they are interested in, it's nonsense, right? You must be guided, you must be pressured, otherwise how the hell do you learn how to learn things? Like, it's good if you have to, maybe if you think that first of all, certain interests pass over time, right? Maybe I don't know, those people say, few homeworks, more free time is better. I personally hated to physically go to school at some point. I got nauseated by it. It was boring to get there mostly. It's not that I didn't like to go to school, but, just I didn't like to wake up early and all this stuff. But to go by bus, or even just when, it was cold, whatever. But the point was mostly that, of course, I understood that this was an imposition, but I also realized that without that test, I wouldn't know how to approach many other things in life. So maybe I can concentrate just on what I would have liked to do, playing the guitar. Then let's assume would have concentrated mostly just for that. But if I had even become a famous guitarist, would have my life become accomplished, successful without having learned about history, or without having learned about physics, or without having learned about art, or or chemistry? These are important questions one should ask. And the point is, if you just teach a person to be whatever they want to do at the moment, especially when they're in their teenage, you're wasting an enormous lot of their potential, in my opinion. Like, their potential is not based on what they can do specifically by applicating in one single field and letting the rest just to perform. Their potential is exactly what they can learn to do potentially in every field, so that then when they arrive at 18, 19, they are kind of very aware human beings that know how many different choices there are and can be more they really can have the tools, right? It's not even about having a choice anymore, right? So I don't know how this other kind of new, allegedly, more advanced educational systems that do not stress discipline or homework or hours and hours of studying as a formula really make people turn out. In my opinion, it's just a way to segment the population, for which there is going to be someone who, of course, is going to specialize or focus on different areas that will fit in the job market, but it's not that they're going to be mature, intelligent, autonomous, critically capable individuals. I absolutely don't think so, by the slightest, right? And I know, because sometimes I'm referring especially to the American educational system that is often criticized because apparently there is too homework, right? You should have seen what mine was, and I can tell you that was great, in my opinion. Of course it was difficult, of course it was hard, but the results were objectively very good. So if you want to fix other educational systems, do not think that, things like homework is the problem. Don't think that that's bad because, look, in the United States we give so much homework. Countries that do better in education, and how exactly, by the way, what are the criteria? Have you ever wondered, when you look at these charts, lists of countries that do better in education, what does it exactly mean, right? What are the standards? Like, is there a kind of a world-like commission that decides whether a guy from this country or this other responds better to that model of education, and especially what are the criteria that you're using there? Like, it's just the school they go to? Because of course, if you compare, Finland to Bulgaria, well, something tells me that Bulgarian students, and this is absolutely not an offense to Bulgarians that I absolutely appreciate, but are going to do worse. But thanks to my eyes, if you look at the broader conditions of those countries. But is that by definition, that is not a criterion that you can use to speak of specifically the Bulgarian educational system in its essentials as working better or worse, because it's two different countries, right? So maybe you understand what the point is, right? You can't teach, for example, it's the same thing I observe in my country, right? In my city that is pretty large, there are certain areas that are disastered, socioeconomically speaking, in the periphery. Of course, kids are going to do bad there, but the educational system is the same. So that has nothing to do with the educational system. There is no magic formula for teaching kids to make, say, better. There is to teach kids, but not to make them be successful given other conditions, right? Other situations of their country, right? So I don't think where they come from, their background, whatever. So I don't think that is a valid way of, and we should point towards instead the realization we need way more education in the form of actual work to be performed. because without that, you don't build a person, right? It's as if you could increase a volume before the container gets sclerotized with age. The less you put in there, the smaller the volume is going to be, and at a certain age, that volume cannot grow anymore, and that's the capacity even of a brain in perspective. So do not come tell me that there are certain countries that do better because of an educational system that is didactically based, because educational systems do not exist without political and social conditions that you have to explain quite clearly, right? And believe me, these differences are felt. In Europe also there are major, right? There are certain countries, especially as we always say of the socialist bloc, that needed to improve dramatically labor force after the Soviet Union, its influence on Eastern Europe collapsed, because they weren't, of course, prepared to capitalism, and they have less years of school, like up to 2. Right, it's you talk to these people, you realize on average that there is a great divide, where a person had 13 mandatory years of education, and comes from a context that has evaluated that education in a very different term. Right, it's useless that we entrench ourselves behind the idea that we are all intelligent and capable. Unfortunately, a large part of people lack these instruments, these tools, and it's a problem. And most of the problems is not educational. Their family, their socioeconomical condition, broadly meant. That once again, it's not that you should the thing of the privileged people and the disadvantaged. That's also nonsense, right? There is no thing like a privilege, and unless you demonstrate that it's actually a discrimination, which in case I don't think our juridical systems actually promote in any way in the West. So that's an excuse, right? It's not that if a person had a better family that could support him financially, or also first of all with affection and support and presence and stability, is a privileged person. That's just a functional family. That happens also without money, I can tell you, because even in my family, in branches in the past, for example, my part of my family was very poor, and one of my parents comes from that background, and they had an excellent balance. As they were poor, they didn't become drug dealers, and they even had a good education. Guess why? Because they actually cared about it, because they told them to study, and they did it, and they had a life, and they had success. And so it was, right? And sometimes they did even well. The people in my family could have called privileged, objectively, and even more than the average, and that instead did less with what they had. So that's why I insist on motivation, because to this stupid loser idea that you are a disadvantaged person, so you're owed something, that's not what will help you, motivationally speaking, to be an autonomous individual, right? And I understand that someone comes and mess up your life. It's not your fault, and you think it's unjust. But there are ways to fix that do not include to take down the people that are actually doing well without doing anything against anyone, right? And I had the direct experience that even in here, money is bullshit, right? It all starts from your brain, your spirit, and the rest is you can still fail. You can, but reacting as if someone actually did, the whole world or the people who actually had it better are your enemies because of this, that's also pretty stupid, right? And you should be ashamed of yourself for even thinking something like this. And don't think that other people do not, even people who have it better, do not suffer other forms of limitation, right? We all do. It can't be like, I don't know, you lose one of your affections when you're very young, or you think that money will help you in that regard. Yes, they will, but how can you say that, I don't know, to a child who loses one of his parents, or both? That's still because they have money, is still more privileged than a kid who maybe didn't suffer that, but maybe has less money. there's so much demagogy about these topics that is that's utterly disgusting. And what we lack here is objectivity. It's all based on relativism in this regard at this point. I'm here like this. Look at me, I'm special, so give me something, right? This is fair in a competitive free market situation if you're able to convince people that you're actually special, which is 95% of the cases. Chances are that you aren't at all. But when it starts becoming pushed as an institutional thing, that starts being a limitation to people's freedom, quite seriously, right? And especially those who actually make good for society. So now half of you will hate me for having said this, and you understand perfectly from what background I count. That's exactly what I've seen by sheer evidence, and there is nothing worse, especially for a young person, to be told, you're disadvantaged, therefore you can't make it. At that age, you're not supposed to be just hanging around doing nothing or whatever you like. At that age, you're supposed to sweat and cry on books because you're upset of the mark you will get the day after. And it doesn't seem that kids anymore care the slightest about this. Some do even wrongly and pathologically, right? Of course, it has to be a limit to this too, because there are children that are, I was saying before, are educated, leaving, by their parents by saying, if you don't get that mark, I would not love you anymore. This kind of thing, this is a bit extreme, but it can't get that harsh. Some situations are pretty crazy sometimes, familiarly speaking. But at the same time, I presume that if you don't have that motivation, you go nowhere, right? And nobody can tell you, in that sense, how much you can arrive to do, right? Until you're not an adult, people can tell you what you have to do, in a sense, including going to school and shutting the hell up if you don't want, right? Because you should only be thankful to live in these times and not in times where people couldn't even go to school because they had to break their back for their entire lives in working in agriculture, right? Now we have this possibility, and you don't even want to go there. You're just a spoiled brat, and you should be ashamed of yourself. Truly ashamed. I mean, that's what we should teach exactly to feel shame for such attitudes, right? That's a positive thing, because we should boost them to do the exact opposite, which is doesn't have to be based on ultra competition either. Has to be based simply on you have to arrive to this point. And look, it's easy. It's not that difficult. I'll teach you how to do it. And we'll do it together if it's necessary, because that's what a teacher is required to do. But don't think, and we will make it true, right? I promise you, because I believe in you. But if you fail, just know that this is part of the process, and we are here exactly to fix that, and you will go on. And there is truly nothing in high school that you can't conceive as the most difficult thing in the scholastic process that you cannot do if you're a functional human being, right? Then of course there are people with disabilities that also have a different life, but that's completely different. Of course there are actually. Well, it turns out, I don't know what it was from the test, this tests that the United States started doing during the Cold War, because in case of the Third World War, they would have had to recruit every able bodied and minded, presumed men at the time, surely were women as well at some point, but to do something, at least not even just as a fighting force, but in the army. And it turned out like that even a pretty high, this is fairly well known, like something between 4 and 8%, I think, no, 4% of the population is completely inept just to even do some of the easiest task is required. Our society has not clearly established what we should do with these people, because it seems like you can't use them in any field. That's a problem. I'm sorry for these people, like in the sense it's not because they are mentally deficient, it's just properly because they can't, right? And there are those limit situations in which you objectively even feel. How many times, let's be honest, was not being frustrated by something that you failed and you said, I'm a loser, I'm too stupid, right? For me, my first concern was, wow, I was too stupid to make this. I'm probably not that special or intelligent, or I will not be successful. Other people will mock me. That's usually the things that come in your mind, especially at that age, right? Because today I can even fail my PhD, but it's not that it's going to change my life dramatically. I don't know, maybe from a moral point of view could happen, but there's still something else I could do for a living that I don't see as a problem. But anyhow, there's full of options, right? So, but at that age, you're just a young adult that is trying to struggle in this world to find his or her own place in the world. With a lot of stuff going on in your mind, and it's not easy, right? Adolescence is not easy. It's never been easy, and it's not supposed to be, because biologically speaking, that's exactly the moment in moments of crisis, in which you toughen up for what life will be. Then you stop growing, and you stop having those problems, and you start having others. But society that now has become, biologically artificial, we could say, in the sense that it doesn't match anymore what we are programmed for genetically, so that we have to respond in different ways to different impulses, albeit we adapt perfectly well most of the times. But that age is crucial, and my advice is always read. I can tell books, a lot of books, right? You shouldn't feel yourself a failure if you in your adolescence you haven't read much, or you don't read books, or I've met people who were very competent, in their own field, who hadn't done that. But I can tell you at that age, everything you can do it's like an investment. Like if you are concerned, even in terms of money, and I'm not kidding, this is not metaphorical. Like reading a book in your adolescence will make you earn easily some $100 in the future. I'm absolutely serious about this. This is material reality. It's not wishful thinking, right? Books, like especially the classics of literature, because if the classics are the classics, there is a reason, right? It's kind of weird when people say, I don't want to read the classics because it's just what other people decided are the classics. I want to read my own stuff. Well, you know what? That when people wrote the classics back in the day, there were lots of other people who were writing in the same fashion, and we don't know absolutely anything about whatever they have even written in the same place, in the first place. Those are classics because went through the meat grinder and they came out as the winners, right? Because they're actually pretty good stuff. So do read the classics of English, French, German, Spanish, Italian, Russian literature, because that is something that you will be thankful for. Start from the Greeks, from the Romans. Just start read the Bible. If you want to make yourself a pleasure, this is not the, Christian propaganda. I'm telling you, read the Bible. Because you have no idea what is written in there. Let's be honest about it. Read the Bible. Like if you want to start, especially from military history, read the Bible. That's the first book you really, if you're reading historical sources about warfare, you want to read about military history, the Bible, easily. The first book you should read. And go on with the classics. I will make a list to you for about stuff you have to read. And this can be very, very, very useful, actually, because people say, also, what should I read? And there are things, at that age, you start, and as it happened to me, it can happen even previously, start really to understand what is important to read and what is not, right? And when you read at that age, you start, it kind of becomes a part of you. I don't know why, but I had all my list of quotes that I liked, that I wrote on a booklet that I got from books, because they made me reflect a lot. I didn't forget them to this day, right? I forget what I studied for, my thesis of hundreds of pages. I didn't forget what I was writing at the time, right? That's what your mind. That's the power of your mind at that age. Whoever underestimates that is a fool. Unfortunately, very few people teach you that. They should, because we really can make a better world if you just read those damn, in your high school life, let's say, even if they were just even 50 books, right? I don't want to exceed, but 50 books, like 10 a year. Your mind is blown away, right? That really changes your way you see it. That's also a risk, because you can become ideologicized because you're so unaware of the world that you presume maybe that something that you have read is so special that you should fall in love with and idolize that. Never do it. Never think a single author is so promising, because it's mostly, what kids do at that age. They don't know what they're actually even reading or following or whatever. So they idealize what they are because they don't know it. Simply, they don't have the experience. They idealize it and they follow it, and they think it's such a great thing, right? Then eventually they start knowing what it is and say, what the hell, did I like this? I personally never followed anyone. Never had a specific myth or a specific figure that I wanted to be like, or never. Not even my family. I always liked to be myself. And that's why I read, because I understood that if I did that, I could create an original synthesis nobody had. Right? And the beauty of it is that naturally everybody lives through the thing differently, so there are different outcomes, right? And don't waste so much time, about I don't know, even relationships. Just be aware that at that age they usually fail, right? You could, maybe forced by circumstances eventually to stick to the same person, maybe because you have a family at that age. It can happen, but generally speaking, do not leave that age intensively, like do crazy stuff sometimes, because that's also important. But for the rest, start to give yourself a discipline already, right? Start showing the rest of the world what you're made of. Start from that at the date age, right? There would be a lot of things I would like to add, because it's really important time. For me, as I told you, like probably, of course, childhood and even the times of the early adolescence, like middle school, were possibly more important. I don't know, but high school is the one that sticks to my mind for the things I've learned on my own. I began to learn on my own, right? This duty that I felt to always do better in spite of what others thought, right? At first you're very passive. Now at that point you begin to do the thing on your own. And what you start doing at that point is immense. You feel a force you wouldn't believe. Right? It's easy to hurt yourself in the process, by the way, but it's worth it. Like, as all things in good measure, but that helps you dramatically to become a human. And it's still hard. So be careful. Like at that age, still follow. Like if something goes wrong, always follow the advice of someone that has like your parents, preferably your friends as well. But people you can, even your professors, your educators, can be positive figures. The elderly. Another advice I can tell you: speak to your grandparents before it's too late. Like, know them, talk with them, ask them what it was when they were your age, what they did. Ask them about even bad things, like I don't know. My grandparents lived during World War II. That was fascinating to listen to them, but just know that they're gonna leave you at some point, and you will have regretted not to ask them. And they should have told you a lot more than what you know today. As far as with any person that you truly love, like try to make treasure of the experience, just of appreciating a person and what the person can teach you. Because after all, affections are there for that reason. They're there to love you, to protect you, but they're also there to teach you how life is made. Right? That's the best thing they can do aside from the essentials, let's say, and that's also why it's very important. My opinion for a parent that they can't give you really the right direction. I think I was very lucky in this regard because my parents have always been there, always. Like without them, I wouldn't be the half of the person I am. But be very careful about this dimension. Don't plan excessively your future in high school, but just be aware that the more you do, the better you do it at that point will help you dramatically for the future, and then the future will come. Don't worry, don't hurry, right? Don't try also to age too quickly, because those years are beautiful the way they are, and ruining them, forcing these steps is wrong at so many levels, right? So this, I leave you on this bit emotional note, and of course, you can ask me again about this stuff. I'm relatively open. Like it's not that I'm going to necessarily tell you about my, everything. After all, what the hell do you care? But what is stressed today is exactly how to evaluate the potential that you have as a young person. And that's possibly, for society, the single most important thing ever. Because you're going to stay, surely, a long time around by these time standards, and that is going to influence a lot of other people. So it's really a practical, materialistic reason, right? I'm brutal about this. It's fine to be sentimental, but just know that here we're talking about if you're going to be good, you can't really do, can't save people from misery at so many levels. So wonder about it, right? Whether you can be or better in that regard. And study everything, from science to history. Everything that you can imagine is out there. Usually, it's fine to have a hobby or a specific interest. We all have, right? When I was little, I was obsessed with ants, and I read a lot of books about ants. That's crazy, right? That's also what my military passion sometimes somewhat stemmed from. But when you're in high school at that point, also try to realize there is a hierarchy of stuff, right? And that's the best time to define the hierarchy. So don't get passionate about bullshit. Let's be honest, right? It's very easy today to be passionate about bullshit because there's so much that people put out there that, of course, the overwhelming majority is mediocre as hell, right? So that's why you talk about the classics, because the classics give you that idea, right? And history helps, right? And then you always have Schwerpunkt from your side. If it's not taken down, I talk about some maybe relatively narrow aspects for a complete education, but we, of course, is not even pretending to be anything close to that. But we expand on a broader picture, and at that age, having a broader picture is very important. Having a broader take on reality, getting the essentials right, it's fundamental, right? Fine. So I probably didn't answer you to your question, but as I said, just feel free to ask again some other thing. I can't make this stuff. Also, let me know if you're bored by this content, or if if I can't make other, because otherwise I regulate myself. As I said at the beginning, I usually talk about this stuff because it doesn't need any preparation. So it's easier for me sometimes, but I don't want to exceed, right? It's just that in this moment I'm very busy, and sometimes I take the opportunity to answer questions that I said I would do at the beginning. Actually, from the first year said, if you have any question, ask. Then I started receiving a lot of different questions that were a bit weird, like either too specific historically, or like that would require a lot more of debate. I could even start making Q&A, like properly answering your questions, but at least I've seen it generates some sort of weird question making. So this topics here instead are very good, in my opinion, because they objectively touch certain topics that are, in my opinion, grossly underestimated, right? And we should instead enormously value them, because really the youth is the most precious element we have. Unfortunately, it sucks because we make a terrible use of it, right? It's normal by a certain standards to be young and stupid, right? It's beautiful, because when you're young and stupid, you don't know that. So you have much less worries, you live much more easily. But you can't be stupid for a long time, because otherwise you're not young anymore, you can't learn anymore at this point. So we have a lot of actually very stupid old people, right? Let me tell you that. I have nothing against boomers or old. That's not part of that dialectical point. It's just that my advice is respect people exclusively for one thing, not their age, not their gender, not wherever they come from. Maybe just with children that objectively are not able to understand certain things, you should be milder, because they are in a delicate situation. But for the rest, respect only intelligent people, because we can't do without the others, right? We can't do in terms of their opinion and their what they have to say about the whole thing. We can surely be very useful as labor force, but and never underestimate a person. That is to say, that person works in a, I don't know, in a plant, I don't know to say that, in an industry or whatever, like it's a average work, doesn't mean that that person isn't educated, right? I got my historical interest actually via my mother, because my maternal grandfather was he had a very unfortunate life actually, but he had a beautiful family, at least, and that's what I was talking about before. They were very poor originally, at least in his generation. Then eventually we had the boom, and so the generation of my mother also started earning fairly well, and so things got fortunately better. He had a serene old age, but he had a very tough life, in the first half of and in the mid 20th century. And he worked very modest work. He was like a guardian. He actually had also an interesting military historical background, I could tell you, but that's also kind of, maybe let's not talk about it. But for the rest, he was poor. He worked every day, but it was not even a moment, not even a day in which for a while he when he went back from work to home, like construction worker and so on, he always had a book in his hands, right? He loved music, he loved history. He was a musician actually, and he told me what it means to love, even if he died actually 4 years before I was born, unfortunately, with cancer. But one of my greatest regrets is I never met him, right? But I love him like crazy, my grandfather. But he has told me post-mortem how much you can love learning, that is never too late, and that you even if you don't have anything, you can learn and improve yourself to become a better self. And this to me is like one of those moral lessons that even if I had it dramatically easy in life, I will never forget, because it's as if a part of all the sufferances that person lived through, like many others, by the way. It's a history of a world of those years, of those generations in many ways. But what they meant, right, in a little part, but still meaningfully to me. And that's also a part of the things that motivate me to do what I do here, right? And I hope it can be, if you think at your families, we all come from a few generations from poor backgrounds, largely, right? Like 90% or more of the people were like that. And even those who had it better actually had terrifically harsh lives. Even my paternal grandfather, for example, had much easier. He was, actually very well placed, but he had a very harsh life throughout, especially World War II. But there are things that today we can't even imagine. And just be aware that those people that we love, evidently, did those things also for us to live in a better world. In that every moment we have here doesn't just belong to us. It belongs to all those people who have done this for you, and without which we would have been nothing. Literally. And that's the respect that we should have for history and why we talk about it. Alright, so now I really finish it, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.